Before we start, I want to thank our sponsor, Kyndryl, for running and reimagining the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find out more about Kyndryl at KYNDRYL, Kyndryl.com. On this show, we have covered the many mental challenges of being a human and how it prevents us from innovating and being more creative. But today's guest shines a light on how we can increase unexpected insights. He shares a refreshing antidote to all the depressing tales in the popular press about how irrational and biased we can be. He is the author of Seeing What Others Don't. Gary Klein, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate getting the chance.
It's been an absolute pleasure reading your book. Let's tell people the origin, because you were collecting all these stories that went against the depressing tales in the popular press about how broken we can be. But you were spotting these people who succeeded despite all the obstacles.
You make it sound much more rational than it ever was. There was never any purpose. There was never any goal. It was simply, I love these stories. You know, you come across the stories and say, that's inspiring. And I would tear them out of magazines, or if it was a book, I'd make a copy of a page or two. And I'd just put them in a stack on my desk. I had you're always fighting for real estate on a desk. So you don't want to frivolously take up some space. But it seemed like I wanted to have these close at hand. So I started collecting these stories, putting them in the stack willy-nilly, and the stack got higher and higher. And sometimes, I'd move things around, but then I'd go through the stack of them, and I'd remember that story, and I'd get sort of stuck looking at the stories again because they're inspiring. Stories of insight are inspiring. So that's the way it went for a while. And then I would give talks. And the presentations would have a slide. It was a very simple slide. I can describe it. It's about improving performance, and the slide just shows two arrows. And one arrow is pointing down, and the other arrow is pointing up. And the idea of the slide is the down arrow is what you want to reduce. You want to reduce mistakes. And everybody knows that. You want to reduce errors. You want to reduce uncertainty. And the up arrow is what you want to increase. You want to increase insights. So that's simple enough. And when I would talk to audiences, I would say most organizations are about the down arrow. They're about reducing errors. They're about gathering more information so there's also uncertainty. But it's mostly about reducing errors. And they have all kinds of techniques for that. And very little is about the up arrow. But you don't want your whole focus for the day to be about reducing errors. You don't want to come home in the evening and tell people say, how was your day? And you'd say, I had a great day. I didn't make any mistakes. That doesn't seem all that of an accomplishment to not make mistakes. So you want to actually achieve things. So the audiences, when I would present this, the audiences liked the slide. And they said, that's our organization. Our organization is all about the down arrow. Okay, so the slide was working, except they would ask me the question, what can you tell us about the up arrow? And my answer was nothing. I don't know anything about insights. I haven't studied it. And people would laugh when I would say nothing. And it's nice to have an audience laughing, except when you're laughing at you. And they kind of were, and for good reason. So this happened to me once when I was in Singapore giving a talk there. And it was a 17-hour flight from Singapore back to the United States. That's a long time to think about the up arrow. And I wondered, is there anything I could do about investigating the up arrow? And then I remembered that stack of clippings is all about insights. So I decided I should do a project about insights. And I used that stack. I added some more and wound up with 120 cases of insight. And I tried to come up with a common theme for where insights come from. And I couldn't. But I came up with a few themes. And I thought that was important too. And in the book, it talks about 3 themes. But for this talk, I'm only describe 2 of them because that's the newer model that I'm coming out with. And the two themes that I found, one of them was about making connections, putting things together. And then this happened. And all of a sudden you have a possibility. It's like fusion, just a fusion of ideas. And the other theme is about seeing that things don't fit together. Wait, that doesn't make sense. Something odd here. That's not what I would expect. And that's sort of like fission. It's like the splitting apart of ideas, and that releases mental energy. So those are the 2 themes that I've discovered, that I identified, that accounted for the cases in reset that I put together. And I've been working on that. The book came out, Seeing What Others Don't, came out in 2013. So it's more than a decade later. But we're realizing, the book also talked about it, a lot of insights don't happen immediately. Like there's a flash of illumination. Some of them, you see something and then you ruminate. Well, I wonder about that. Are these really, and you're thinking about it. So these are like a chain reaction that's put into place to come up with the insight. So that's where we are in thinking about insight. Now, one way that's important is that a century ago, in 1926, Graham Wallace published a book about insight. And it was a great book, great examples, and very impressive. And he described a 4-stage model where you're working on a problem and you're stuck. And you can't figure out, how's this going to work out? How's this going to get resolved? And then you go away and you sort of relax and think about other things. That's like a period of incubation. And then all of a sudden, whammo, you have a flash of illumination and you say, now I see what's going on. And then the 4th stage is to just examine it, reflect on it, see how it applies. And that's an important model. And it has driven insight research in laboratory settings for the past century, where people will give their subjects a task that looks unsolvable, let them wrestle with it, and then see what happens for people to all of a sudden have that flash of illumination. And so that research is important research. But what we've found is that paradigm doesn't account for most of the insights in our case base. It accounts for less than 10%. So the paradigm that's often studied is missing the great majority of insights that people come up with. So I think that's important because it has implications for what you can do and what you should be trying to do to increase it.
I shifted around how I was going to approach the episode because of what you said there, and we'll go with your latest work. But I wanted to jump to chapter 12, which is about how organizations obstruct insights. Maybe I thought we'd present the problems first and how they inadvertently suppress the insights of their workers. And this is a really important thing you said, that because of the DNA of an organization, they value predictability, they recoil from surprises, and they crave perfection, which is essentially the absence of errors. Surprises and errors can play havoc with plans and smooth operations. In their zeal to reduce uncertainty and minimize errors, organizations fall into the predictability trap and the perfection trap. I thought we'd explain those two traps that is the bane of so many of the listeners to this show, Gary, who work in innovation.
Right. That's one of my favorite chapters of the book. And it's really a depressing and important discovery that I made. You have all these organizations and they say, we really want to foster insights. We want to foster innovation. And they're not just saying if they believe it, but they act in a way that interferes with insight. And the reason is insights are disorganizing. And if you're an organization, you want everything to go smoothly. You want to be able to have projects and you have a project plan and you have a schedule, you have milestones and you have resources to program in and everything. You got everything nicely laid out. And insights will say, well, wait a second, we could do this. Wait a second, this could be a problem. We better switch gears. And now your plan is starting to fall apart and the adaptations are starting to grow if you let them. And organizations don't want that to happen because it's going to be chaotic. And so the perfection trap is I don't want to take a chance on making errors. And one study presented people with ideas and said these are new and creative and others are, tried and true. And people have a negative reaction to things that are new and creative. They recoil, they say, if they're new, they could be wrong. Or they're something could happen that's unexpected. And so there's a nervousness about trying something new. I once had a potential client who wound up not being a client who said, Gary, we want you to do something for us that will be totally new. And I said, great. And I presented something that I felt would be quite valuable. And he came back and they said, I pitched it to my team. And they said, yeah, but has been tried before. Has anybody done it before? Of course, we don't want to take any risks. So yes, it's hard to come up with something that's totally new that has been tried and established. So that's the trap of perfection. The predictability trap is, like surprises. And surprises are important because we found that one of the ways that people fail to get insights is they become fixated on an idea that isn't working, that is a flawed belief. And we often speculate and we have ideas that aren't quite right. And if you don't want to have any possibility of an incorrect idea, that really is going to limit you. So people are worried about that type of a dynamic. They want things to run smoothly and in ways that they can anticipate and prepare for. And if we have a bad idea, a flawed idea, it's all right to have a flawed idea. What's not all right is to fixate on it and get stuck on it. And that's what really hangs people up, is they get stuck on ideas that are limited in some way, are incomplete, misleading, and possibly wrong. So I looked in my sample about how many cases were there where people escaped from a flawed idea and how did they do it? And the way they did it is they noticed something, because if you have a flawed idea, there's going to be anomalies. And you're going to make predictions that aren't going to work out. And if you're really fixated on the flawed idea, you're going to explain away all this contrary evidence to hold on to an idea because it's precious to you. But the people who have the insights noticed the discrepancies. They noticed the anomalies. They said, I wonder what's happening. I wonder what this is all about. Let me inspect it a little bit more. And they're the ones who make the discoveries. So a key here is being alert to surprises, unexpected events because they can pry you loose from your flawed ideas. And a simple example, more than a century ago, is Wilhelm Röntgen was studying cathode rays, and he had an apparatus that was generating cathode rays, and then he had some cardboard to block the rays, and that was the way he was doing the research. But there were some photographic plates on the nearby on the other side of the room that were getting fogged. And so, why they get a problem is when we turn on a generator, and he wondered, and he inspected it, and he didn't know what. Oh, they weren't light because you had the cardboard blocking the light. They were something else, and he didn't know what. He called them X-ray because he didn't know what they were, and he had discovered X-rays. And if you took an X-ray of his wife's hand, she looked at, and the X-ray showed the bones of her hand, and she looked at it, and she said, "I've seen my death." He puts it in the right the skeleton. And he won the first Nobel Prize in Physics for his discovery. At the same time, another researcher, I think it was in Cambridge, I think his name was Frederick Smith, was also studying cathode rays. And he was noticing that there was some fogging of plates in the room. And he told his assistant, "Move those further away because we don't want that to keep happening." He had the discovery in his hands, and he missed it. It was there. He had the same evidence, but he explained it away, or it was inconvenient, and he didn't get curious about it, and he failed to make the discovery.
I love how you present that in the book about the idea of these twin moments that people have. And I thought we'd share a couple of those twin moments because I'm sure people have this themselves. We all have these moments where you might have an idea, maybe it's an invention, and you go, "Oh, wouldn't it be great if," and then somebody else has the same thought but actually does something about it, or sits with it and lets it marinate, but actually then takes action on it as well. And as you say, most of us end up being very passive, and the organizations we work for make us passive in the first place. But before we share some of those, and there's so many brilliant ones in the book, Gary, as he said, studied 120, collected all these stories, really, really examined them, sat with them, challenged them over time. But you say that the down arrow, this idea of reducing risk and uncertainty in organization, are motivated by the desire for predictability and perfection in organizations. And the methods interfere with insights in several ways. One, so think here, if you're a leader of an organization or if you're working for somebody, they're distracting. They chew up people's time on tasks that don't contribute to insights. They leave less time to speculate and imagine. This is all stuff that we're working on to reduce uncertainty and error, maybe checklists. These error avoidance rituals eat into the time for being thoughtful, the up arrow, the insights, the time for spinning stories and following speculations to see where they might go. And I thought here, Gary, about the brilliant examples you give, and in a way, the tragic examples you give. One of them you gave about this guy, the FBI analyst, Kenneth, I can't remember his surname, Kenneth Williams, who saw this anomaly where he suspected that they were practicing flying, but they didn't want to practice landing or taking off. And he, in a way, he predicted that this was a challenge, and it was just before 9/11. That was one of the many, many examples you give that are that led to tragedies because nobody would listen to them. One was because they were junior, and two, and I think this was such an important lesson I learned from you, was that information didn't fit anywhere. And it also happened in the Egyptian war that you mentioned in the book.
It's astonishing how the discoveries are there, like with Frederick Smith with X-ray. They're there, but they're not part of our existing mental model. And instead of getting curious about them, we become impatient or annoyed, or we just brushed them aside. So this memo was getting propagated about these pilots from the Middle East taking these lessons who didn't care about taking off and landing. And we thought it was odd and maybe significant, but it got stopped along the chain. And that's a problem with organizations. If you have a hierarchical organization, it means anybody along the chain can squelch an idea. And then it doesn't go any further. And that's what happened here. And the discovery didn't get made and tried to do anything about it and to start tracking these gentlemen and see what they were up to and to try to stymie them. So what do organizations do? I once was working with one of the intelligence organizations in the United States, and they had a real fear of ever making a prediction or a forecast that might be wrong. So that meant that their forecasts were as bland as possible. And they had an office about tradecraft, about the steps you have to follow in order to do a good job, to try to prevent errors. So I talked to the person who was there, who had set up that office. And I said, we've got this office about reducing the chance of errors. Do you have another office for increasing insights? And she looked at me and she said, no, why would we do that? And I thought, why is the United States spending so many hundreds of millions of dollars on your agency if you're not trying to come up with more insights, if you're just trying to be afraid of saying the wrong thing? An example was in around 1989. There was a junior analyst in the CIA, and he was following world events. And he saw that the conditions that were keeping East and West Germany apart, those conditions had changed as the Soviet Union was coming apart itself. It's not clear that East and West Germany had to be divided. And he was excited about this. And he wrote a memo describing how this was a possibility. Well, that put everybody in a tizzy because it might be wrong and seemed very daring. It seemed very risky. So they reviewed it and they made him put in one caveat after another about how he collected the data and what the implications were. And by the time you read the final version of his brief that got published, if you didn't know what his insight was, you'd have trouble finding it out. So he was there, he was predicting it, and they wound up just neutering it before they allowed it to re-release. Now, a few months later, two of the heads of the CIA were in Washington briefing George H.W. Bush about world events. And one of the things they said is, and East and West Germany are going to remain divided because that was what everybody believed. That was, the law of the time. And they were telling Bush this. And then there's a knock on the door. And it's Bush's executive assistant. Very apologetic to interrupt this reader. And they open the door. They say, come in. And she opens the door. She said, I'm very sorry to be interruptive you, but you might want to turn on television right now. And they turned on the television and they saw the images of people sitting on the Berlin Wall with sledgehammers knocking it over. And this was not a good moment for the CIA because they had just been briefing Bush that this would not happen. But the real shame of this was there was an analyst who saw it. And that analyst never got heard because organizations swoosh any kinds of unexpected, anomalous ideas like that, especially coming up from the bottom.
Gary, you mentioned that actually in the book, that team you worked with, this was an intelligence team that you said this, you called this out inside the organization, that junior analysts often had information that they suppressed because there was nowhere to put that information, or they didn't want to be the person calling out that information because they suffered from the mum effect, or the shooting the messenger effect. And that is everywhere in organizations, that people don't want to rock the boat.
So I'll tell you another story. This was a project that we did a number of years ago, and we wanted to study something called a garden path phenomenon, where people get on a garden path and they just stay there, even though it's not going to be the great path, but they're just sort of, they're fixated. They're locked into that garden path. We wanted to see what it would take to get them off the garden path. So we made up a couple of scenarios where the scenario started with something obvious that was happening. And then the scenario continued, and we gave additional information that indicated that the original belief wasn't right. We wanted to see how much additional information it would take before the team. We studied 7 different teams before they got off the garden path. And the answer was clear. None of the teams ever got off the garden path. They held on to the original belief right to the end. So that was noteworthy. However, as I said, these were 7 teams. Each one had 4 people. And we had each of them with a laptop where they could take notes of what they were thinking about. And then we could examine your notes afterward. And we found that in every one of the teams, at least 1, if not 2 out of the 4 people noticed the anomalies and started to worry about, maybe we've called this wrong. Maybe the original belief isn't correct. But they never said anything. So if you think about the team mind, these people who notice the problem are the unconscious of the team mind, but it never got surfaced for the team to talk about it. And we thought that was unfortunate and that was worrisome, but it's typical of teams in the way they operate. So I was briefing the results to one of the intelligence communities in the United States. And there was a large audience. And one of the senior members of that agency said, well, that was that country. It would never happen here. And 1 or 2 of the junior people in the room, very nervously, but courageously raised their hand. He said, it does happen here. It happens here. We've seen it. We've been part of it. We see what happened when people go against the dominant belief. We see the effect it has on them, and we don't want to speak up. So that's part of the dynamic. That's part of the stultifying effect of organizations, to stay fixated and to prevent themselves from learning and adapting and innovating.
Gary, there was a line that just struck me in the book where you talked about, say, somebody who does, so you're maybe head of innovation, or you're in charge of change within inside an organization. You're listening to your people, you're listening to those junior analysts. You then present those ideas to your own director, and the director pushes back and go, no, that's off scope, pushes back and says, that's not going to the plan. Remember the plan you agreed to, Aidan, that very predictive plan of how it's going to go? And you say here then, your director has started to look at you as someone he'll have to keep an eye on, no longer a person who can be counted on, and you have work to do to restore your reputation. And in that moment, and most of us have been there, in that moment, they've kept a receipt on you, there's a record on you, and you're in trouble because you're the person who's actually going, we need to deviate here. And I loved some of the stories you told. I'm going to come to the story of Stark, because Stark was this commander who actually did pay attention to, before Pearl Harbor, the disaster of Pearl Harbor for the US, actually saw that there was a vulnerability here, did see it, did write a memo about it. But as you say, he then got busy with the day-to-day. He had to get busy with putting out other fires, and he dropped the insight. And a counterpart in Japan didn't. And this is one of those twin moments, these sliding door moments that Japan were on the right side of.
Right. So what had happened, it was in the early days of World War II, and the British had attacked an Italian fleet, I think in the Bay of Taranto, and they attacked them with very crude precursors of aircraft carriers to launch a raid on this fleet, and with torpedoes. And it was a surprise raid, very successful, and knocked out a good portion of the Italian fleet. And Stark was one of the top admirals in the U.S. Navy, and he read about it and said, "We have a fleet like that in Pearl Harbor. I wonder if we might be vulnerable." And at the same time, and Stark came up with this even before the Japanese did, but Yamamoto in Japan read about the Taranto raid and said, "The Americans have a fleet in Pearl Harbor. I wonder if we can attack it." And so he developed the plan for the knockout punch that was intended to be a knockout punch at Pearl Harbor. Stark sent a memo where we need to have torpedo nets, we need to have defenses, but it never got acted on. And it didn't get acted on because it's just inconvenient. I mean, you have all these torpedo nets, and then you got to take them out when the ships have to sail in and out, and it was a real pain in the neck to do that. And you might want to have 24-hour reconnaissance around Pearl Harbor, but that takes up a lot of manpower, and the people who are just flying loops around Pearl Harbor aren't getting the training they needed. So for all kinds of practical reasons, Stark's recommendations simply didn't happen. And one of the things that I've been working on recently about insights and organizations is building on my original discoveries that organizations are really afraid of insights and are engaged in all kinds of activities that are going to be counterproductive, that are going to interfere with insights. And I'm working on an insight audit for organizations. And this will be in the new book, but that won't be for a couple of years. But we're already planning to do some work with some financial service organizations. We've already done some, which is to audit the organization and to see what happens in their meetings. One organization I work with, their meetings were all about the down arrow. It was a financial services organization, and they'd say, "Who made decisions about what to invest in that didn't work out? And we want to cut down all of those." But they never talked about the successes. They never talked about the insights and who had insights in the past week or two and where did those come from. And at the end of it was a one-day workshop. At the end of it, I told him that. And he said, "You're right. You're right. We're going to have to change our tone and open up to the up arrow and not be so much about blaming and avoiding errors." So part of this audit of an organization is what happens in meeting. What is the culture about? Just about reducing error, or is it about encouraging insights? What about reviews? So many organizations pride themselves that they have really tough review processes for any new idea for a new product that the organization might start to invest in. And they'd say, "We've come through the ringer. We're making sure that there's no possible thing that could go wrong." And a friend of mine who was, until he just retired, until recently, he was the chief innovative officer for a company that had some insights maybe 15 years ago that had really built its business tremendously. And he said, "Gary, ever since then, we have these murder boards. We've had at least 50 good ideas come across the horizon, and we haven't funded a single one because the murder boards can find something that might go wrong or some possibility, and they just have a real aversion to making any kind of a risky gamble. So another part of it is just the way the whole review process works. Another part of it, and you mentioned it, Aidan, is the way projects are structured. And so you give me a project and say, Gary, here's the goal, and here are the resources, and I come up with the plan. Everything is tightly buttoned down. But what about making discoveries along the way? What about reprogramming resources? What about shifting schedules? Well, that creates all kinds of headaches. And so people would just as soon not do it. And there was one study, I think it was recorded in the Harvard Business Review, where a large number of managers were given a toy problem where there was a goal that they were supposed to pursue. And then in the toy problem, information came out that rendered that goal obsolete. It was like a garden path, the garden path study that I showed you. They wanted to see how people would respond to this information. And the managers, almost all of them, held on to the original goal because they had pledged to pursue that goal. And they didn't want to be seen as the person who can't be relied on, the person who's freelancing or using their own intuition.
You reminded me of a great line I heard, Gary. I can't remember who told me this one. It was like, we don't ship ideas from this organization. Sometimes they escape. I was like, well, that's all. A lot of these case studies you share in the book are ideas that escape despite the system that they lived in. There was so many ideas sparking for me to bring us all over the place. I just thought we'd share the sequel to the Stark and Yamamoto story, which links to this idea of people not speaking up, or actually people do speak up and then they're suppressed. This led to the Battle of Midway in 1942. I'd love to share that.
Okay, sure. So now the Japanese have had this tremendous victory, the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, and knocked out so much of the American battleships. They really wanted to take out the American aircraft carriers, but those weren't in Pearl Harbor. And then the Japanese, because they were prepared for war, were just winning battle after battle throughout the Pacific. And the Americans were wondering, where's going to be the next Japanese attack? And are they going to start moving closer to the West Coast? And where is it that they're going to attack next? And there's two parts of this story. One is Joe Rochefort, who was a Navy intel officer, looking at the map, said, if I was the Japanese, I'd attack at Midway Island. And they had broken some of the Japanese code and found that there was a reference to the next Japanese attack. I think it was AF or something like that, but nobody knew where AF was. And Rochefort said, I think it's Midway, but how can I be sure? So he contacts people. He sends out a message on open channel that he knows the Japanese are monitoring, saying there's been a problem with the water purification system on Midway Island. And then there was a part of the Japanese code that they had broken where the word goes out, the ships going to AF should bring extra water with them. Okay. So he had come up with an insight about how to identify where the Japanese were going to attack. Now, the Japanese, as they were doing their war games for Midway and how it was going to work out. And there was one junior officer who was playing the role of the Americans. And he said, what if the Americans sail a few aircraft carriers up to Midway to thwart our attack? And people in the room, including Yamamoto, said, the Americans would never do that. That's too daring. It's not part of their makeup. We've studied them. And he said, but I think, and he was shouted down. I think he might have left the room in tears because he was so humiliated. But of course, he was right that the Americans did send 3 or 4 aircraft carriers to the Midway area, waiting for the Japanese attack. And then we had this wonderful, on the American side, the wonderful victory at Midway because the Japanese weren't expecting that we would do it. But the Japanese had a junior officer, and he was trying to play that theme in the war game, and he was stifled. So it's not that the Japanese broke the code and we didn't. Both sides were equally culpable.
Another Gary who was on the show, Gary Hamill, had a great line. He said, oftentimes leaders fail with the future, not because it's unpredictable, because it's unpalatable. And it came to mind where they just didn't want to hear that information. It was just like, I don't want to hear it. And that came up again in one of the stories you told about the war in Israel against Egypt. And the head of intelligence was told time and time again that this was happening. And I'd love you to share this story.
Oh, it's a painful story going back to 1973. And it got repeated a half a century later in October 7th. So it's almost the exact same theme. So the Egyptians and the Israelis in the early 1970s were at war. And there was a fear that would the Egyptians attack across the Suez Canal and attack the Israelis in the Sinai Peninsula on the east side of the Suez Canal. And the head of intelligence, Major General Eli Zara, said the Egyptians won't do that. They won't do anything that risky until they have air superiority in that area, or at least parity of air power, and they don't have that. So therefore, we don't have anything to worry about. That's called, in Israel, it's referred to as the conception. He was gripped by this conception and fixated on it. But there was all kinds of evidence that the Egyptians were planning an attack in 1973 in October. There were spies who were reporting this. There was movement of troops, and the Egyptians said, this is just for training purposes, but the way the troops were being moved had no relevance to any kind of training activity that was going on. And what the Egyptians were also doing was, in opposition to the treaty, they were moving anti-air weapons to take care of the Israeli planes. So even though they didn't have an air force to match the Israeli air force, they had the anti-air capabilities to knock out the Israeli planes and counter the Israelis. And Zara was insisting, we don't have anything to worry about. Things are fine, up to a few hours before the attack. And they showed layout of what was going on for some senior general who were appalled at all the evidence suggesting an attack. And so they figured out that an attack was coming, but only a few hours before, not enough time to mobilize. The Israelis had I don't think they even had 200 troops on the east side of the Suez Canal, and the Egyptians crossed, and it was a crushing surprise and a very dangerous moment for Israel, because Syria had attacked from the northeast, and Egypt is attacking across the Suez Canal And it was a critical moment for Israeli survival. And you'd think the Israelis would have learned. And then as we're looking at October 7th, and we're seeing that there were people who are trying to sound the alarm, something's going on in the Gaza Strip, and we might have a real problem here. And that message was not getting up through the chain of command. It was being dismissed because they had a conception that Hamas was not intending to attack. And despite the evidence that they were, Hamas had just been so convincing in their denials that the Israelis were caught flat-footed yet again, almost to the day, 50 years later.
It's incredible, Gary, how there's a quote by Mark Twain, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And it's why I love looking at books like this and sharing them, because these things don't go away. They're there. And again, to your point in the book, most people had insights by going to different types of events, maybe going and listening to a different speaker, reading something outside their field of expertise. And that sparked a little insight for them, that mix. And you mentioned about connections, two different things from two different realms mixed together, create something new. And then they had the wherewithal to go and take action on them.
Right.
But sometimes I thought we'd share the brilliant example. I love this. It's a lesser known story about Napoleon that you shared in the book. And Gary, I made a cartoon to go with this. I was saying to you, I've been sharing your work on LinkedIn. I'll show you this little cartoon to share the Napoleon story. But I'll leave this up on the screen and maybe you'll tell the story of this. I love this, the battle at Toulon.
I'm only going to tell the story if you'll send me a copy of this cartoon.
I'll send you everything. Gary, I have so many. I'm going to send you. I told you, you've sparked so many insights for me. I'm very happy to do so. And loads of articles that I've written over Christmas. I was saying to you, I had a joy of reading this book over Christmas. Christmas reads are always my favorite because I don't have any conflicting work and I can really just absorb and enjoy the content. I absolutely love this book.
Okay, so what's happening here is this is very early in Napoleon's career. And the British, because of their naval superiority, have blockaded the French down in the south at Toulon. And the French have tried to break out of this blockade time and again, and they have failed. And the general in charge keeps failing. And eventually, and Napoleon is there, and his specialty is artillery. That's an important part. He's aware of artillery, especially light artillery. And the importance of light artillery is you can move it. It's not like a heavy cannon that's, cemented in place. You can move it around. And Napoleon was aware of how the Americans, how Knox and the American Revolution had moved artillery from the north down to the Boston area and threatened the British supply routes and forced the British to evacuate Boston. So Napoleon's aware of this. And he's looking at all of the attempts to break free out of the city. And he said, there's a choke point, not in the city, up in the harbor. And there's a hill there with some lightly manned forts. We can send some units up there and take those forts, take control of that hill, and bring some light artillery there. And now all of the British ships are going to be threatened if they stay in the harbor because we control this pinch point. And he got permission to do that, led the attack. I think he might have suffered a bayonet wound in his leg while they were mounting the attack. And all of a sudden, the British look up and they see that They're getting trapped because the light artillery are commanding a pinch point into the harbor, and the British have to leave. And they're not driven out by a direct face-to-face battle. They're driven out because Napoleon found a leverage point. He identified a critical leverage point that could be easily wielded in order to turn the tide. And that's what this cartoon brilliantly illustrates. I'm very impressed by this cartoon.
I've loads more for you, Gary. I love that story, and it's the source of my article that I'm writing. I'll publish next week as well, because it reminded me of this story. There's a thing called the 36 stratagems. I don't know if you know that story of the 36 stratagems. I'll send it on to you. It's an ancient Chinese text, and it basically says the way you deal with this. I'll get the exact quote for you here, Gary. Bear with me for a second. It says, when confronted with a powerful enemy, do not fight them head on, but try to find their weakest spot to initiate their collapse. This is the weak overcoming the strong, right? So that's part of that story, but the stratagem is even better.
This is the Mann Gulch example in I think the late 1940s out in the West. And it was, I think, August. It was very hot, very dry, a very dangerous time for forest fires. And there was a forest fire that was starting to burn, and the Forest Service decided that they could attack it, they could put it out. And Mann Gulch was a gulch running between two hills. And the strategy was to land on the western hill, at the top of that hill, and then march down to I think it was the Missouri River, and then attack the fire. The fire was on the eastern slope, and attack the fire from below. You want to attack it from below because fires move upward. So you don't want to be in the path of the fire head on. You want to be below it, just sort of smothering it that way. So that was the plan. And so Wagner Dodge, who was the head of the team of about 14 smoke jumpers, they got dropped off there. They're marching down the western slope. And then Wagner Dodge looks down and he sees some puffs of smoke at the bottom of his hill, of this slope, the western slope. And he immediately sizes up the situation. Somehow a few embers must have floated over and ignited the vegetation on the western slope. And that is going to immediately trigger an inferno. And it's going to start burning, and it's going to come towards us up the slope. And we have to change our plan. So he tells his crew, we have to run for our lives here. This is going to be a dead zone in a very short time. And, drop your tools and start running. So they are running. I have been to Mann Gulch. I have been to that site when I was much younger, and I was jogging. I wasn't a great jogger, but I wasn't terrible either. And I tried running up. It was such a steep slope. You just get exhausted very quickly. So they are making their way up as quickly as they can up the slope. He looks back and he sees a wall of flame coming up the western slope right towards them. And he realizes they don't have a chance. They're not going to be able to outrun it. Actually, two of the men did outrun it by moving off out of the direct path, but the rest of them didn't have a chance to do that. So Wagner Dodge is desperate, and I call this creative desperation. What am I going to do to keep from myself and my crew from being burned alive? And he's running through this tall grass, cheap grass, and it's hard to run through, and it's going to be the fuel for the fire. The fire is going to just eat this cheap grass and sweep up. And it says, wait a second, I can set an escape fire. I can set a fire of this cheap grass up the hill from where I'm going and burn it down. And then I can dive into the ashes, and there's no fuel. And so when the forest fire gets up to me, it's not, I'm going to be safe. And he just makes up this escape fire idea that he had never heard of before. He just invented it on the spot. And he tells the other people, follow me, to have them follow him into the ashes. But nobody would, because setting a fire while you're running from a forest fire made no sense to them. That's what you talked about before. It didn't fit their existing mental model of what you do when you're trying to escape from a fire. You don't set a fire. But that's what he did, and he survived.
It's a tragic but great story to prove the point. And what you said also was those two survivors, the two other gents, they were the only ones who were left to actually say, he did say it to us, but we thought he was going crazy when he did this, So I say that because that's what happens many people inside organizations. When you're the person who has the courage to suggest an idea, oftentimes people kind of go, oh my God, Aidan's lost it here, or we got to keep an eye on him. He's not conforming to the way things are done around here. I told Gary,
except that the time when people might listen is when it looks like you're about to be swallowed up by a forest fire. So that's why in the book, I refer to it as creative desperation. It's when you're desperate that you might be open to trying something really unconventional. In ordinary times, you wouldn't. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
no, beautiful. Thanks for saying that. And that's so true. And it's a beautiful, one of the connections I made. So one of the things, Gary, I'm so blessed with this show because I do study the book. Like, I read the book, I absorb it, and I write about it. And I write about it to almost spark connections. And one of the things I noticed was when I was reading about the people like Barry Marshall or the gents who experimented with mosquitoes to discover about yellow fever, who actually infected themselves. These people, when I was reading about that, I was like going, you know what? That's a theme that comes up in all these superhero comics all the time, that the people who are the villains, like, for example, the Green Goblin, or Dr. Doc Ock, these guys that are in the Spider-Man comics, they were actually good scientists. And they were making these experiments for the betterment of humanity, and the experiment went wrong, or they couldn't get around regulation or bureaucracy. So they said, you know what, I'm going to just try it on myself. And in the comic books, they get punished for this. This idea, I think it's called the Frankenstein complex, where you're punished for trying things on yourself. But actually, what you show is that these people had to do it because nobody would believe them because they thought they were crazy, or they were just vilified by the scientific community. And I thought we'd share your favorite of these examples.
That's a nasty question. What's my favorite of the example? It's like asking somebody which of their children they love the most. I love all of these stories.
Well, go for them. If you have time, I'm happy to hear them all, brother.
Okay, the people who tried this thing, the two that you mentioned are probably the two best examples. So with yellow fever, it was and is a scourge, and it's carried by, we now know it's carried by mosquito. But at the time, 125 years ago, the idea of a microbe living in a mosquito that could kill a person, could kill a human, didn't really make sense. And there had been a physician down in that area in Central America, and I think Panama, who raised the possibility that it was mosquitoes. But that they had tried an experiment. They had mosquito bite somebody who had yellow fever and then bite somebody else who did not have yellow fever, and the person who without yellow fever wasn't affected. So when Walter Reed and his team went down there to see what they could do, they were told, don't waste your time with the mosquito hypothesis. It's been disproven. So that's one thing that they knew, that the mosquito hypothesis was wrong. And they thought, how is yellow fever propagating? Well, it could be with bad air. And that the air that you're breathing in was unhealthy and really needed better sanitation and things like that. And so they were doing that investigation, but they had some other evidence. There was the case of a jail cell with about a dozen men in the jail cell, and they were sharing the same filthy conditions, the same blankets. One of them came down with yellow fever. Well, how could only one of them come down with yellow fever? Because they were all in the same horrible condition. That didn't make sense unless something like a mosquito had come through the bars. So they wondered about that. But no more than that. And then Walter Reed was away, and his two assistants were still there. And they heard about a case in, I think it was New Orleans, where a ship had arrived and it was being quarantined for about 12 days. And then people got off and found that yellow fever was being spread. And the person who was in charge of the harbor said, I wonder about this 12-day quarantine period. So the guys in Panama wondered about that too, and thought maybe there's an incubation period, that if a mosquito bites somebody with yellow fever, maybe it takes 12 days for whatever's happening, and they didn't know what it was, to mature so that the mosquito can infect somebody else. So they set up an experiment with themselves, and they had the mosquito bite somebody with yellow fever, and then they segregated the mosquitoes, kept them alive for 12 days, and had the mosquito bite them to see what would happen. And the answer was devastating. They both came down with yellow fever, and one of them died. And the other one was hospitalized, and the nurse said later he was just raving kinds of nonsense about the mosquitoes. But when Reed came back, the one who didn't die, who survived, explained what happened. And now they appreciated the incubation period. They appreciated what they had to do to try to reduce the spread of yellow fever. They had to make sure there wasn't standing water. They just had to attack the mosquito population and reduce it. And only by taking those kinds of measures were they able to get yellow fever under control and allow the Panama Canal to get built.
I was going to show you another cartoon I created to illustrate this, because I was so inspired by all these great stories. I was like, I have to share them in some way. So this idea of the comic book character, but this idea, so for those who are just listening to us, it's a guy who's experimented on himself, and he's in front of a board of scientists, and they say, this may save countless lives, but it's not the way we do things around here. And they suppress the idea, which is the way it's actually done. And Gary shows so many stories of this, but luckily what's inspiring about it is people who actually made it despite being held back and found a way around it. Barry Marshall, I mentioned many stories in there. Gary, I know I'm taking up lots of your time. I thought we'd share one last story. Again, a little cartoon that just illustrates this beautifully. And I loved this because you talk about in the book about how we build these systems like computers, and the systems like, say, for example, I lecture in Trinity College here in Dublin, and I tell the students, when you're doing an essay, don't rely on something like Google or even now ChatGPT or any of these GPTs. Don't rely on them because they'll pull insights from the regular sources. And not surprisingly, that's what you did brilliantly in this book, is you pulled insights from irregular sources, places you collected them from over the years. And that way, those insights are truly beautiful. And if you work in a field, as you say in the book, it's often newcomers to a field that spot insights and connections that others can't because they aren't laden down by the way things were done in that field before. And they don't have the foundations of that field to rely on like so many other people. So they break the mold. And in the chapter where you tell the brilliant story of Daniel Boone, you talk about how the stronger the design, the weaker the insights. And you have 4 design principles that you list at the beginning of the chapter. And they all depend on order and structure, whereas insights, you say, are disorderly by design. To change the way decision aids and information technologies are designed, developers would have to pay less attention and to how the work was done in the past and more attention to giving decision makers room to discover, giving them more freedom to modify their tasks. And the way you introduce this is beautifully where you tell the story of Daniel Boone. And I'll share the illustration I have of this one. I share this one today on LinkedIn. I'll share it with you, Gary, afterwards. It's a great story. And this is how I encapsulated it. For the people who are just listening to us again, most people are listeners to the show rather than viewers, Gary. It's a picture of Daniel Boone pointing one way and a project manager saying, that's not in scope. Over to you, Gary.
All right. So Daniel Boone, I think this was in Kentucky and Frontier, and they had a settlement, and people were doing various chores and errands. And Daniel Boone's daughter Jemima and 2 of her friends were out on a nearby stream, a small river, and some Indians, I think they were Shawnee, had crept down and saw this and saw an opportunity and quickly paddled over to where the girls were, dragged them into the canoes, pulled them across the river, and started to and kidnap them, and essentially had the 3 girls and were kidnapping them, bringing them away. And the word got out that about this kidnapping. So Daniel Boone was delegated to lead the expedition, and he's a good tracker. And so they're following the Indians and following where they're going, and he's looking at twigs and he's looking at broken stems, and some of the girls were leaving little pieces of wool or flows as a way of signaling where they were. And so Daniel Boone is leading this party to catch up with the Indian. That's the project plan in your cartoon. That's what they're doing. And as they're doing it, after hours, he realizes he's not gaining on the Indians. He's actually losing ground. So they're moving faster because they know where they're going, and he's got to be looking for all these signs, and he's just not able to keep pace with them. And he decides this project plan isn't going to succeed. But he thinks the indication was that they were Shawnee. And he said they're moving north from Kentucky. And I imagine they're bringing these girls to the Shawnee village, maybe in Old Town in Ohio, across the Ohio River. And there's some streams there, since they didn't have their canoes with them. They had left canoes on the Ohio River to cross the Ohio River. And they're going to have to cross this stream in order to get there. and there's one obvious place to cross the stream. So instead of trying to catch up with the Indian, let's go directly to that crossing point. Let's just gamble that that's the direction they're heading and just be there. And so they throw away the project plan. That's the guy looking at the clipboard, and said, we're going to head towards the place where it's easy to ford the stream, and hopefully that'll work for us. And in fact, they get there. The Indians already are there. They've been sort of setting up to spend the night, and Daniel Boone and his party catch the Indians by surprise, rescue the three girls, and the whole thing is a success. And if Daniel Boone had a decision aid telling him what to do, it would be saying, no, this way, would be correcting him, pointing him to try to keep him on the original plan, not realizing that the original plan had become obsolete.
Gary, I usually have a lot of notes, but I had a lot of notes in this episode, and I'm going to share it through the Thursday Thought, which is a weekly article I write, and also on LinkedIn. But before we finish up, I thought maybe because you have that new book coming out, the new version of Seeing What Others Don't, maybe we'll cover that in the future, and we'll cover actually how to do it and how to have insights, and we'll talk about those two things that you the connections element and the anomalies element in that future episode. But before we wrap up, you have loads of content, and you work with organizations working on creating the culture to be able to spot insights and develop insights and get them to the top from the bottom of the organization, including the audits, etc. Where can people find out about that, and where can people find about your videos and the content you produce?
Great. We have a website. My company has a website, www.shadowboxtraining.com. And that is our website. And you can also find some videos that we have put out. One video is a masterclass in practical decision making. It's 15 episodes, and each episode is only 5 minutes. So you can watch one episode a day and just start your day with it for a few weeks. The second video is on the cognitive dimension. And then the third video has just appeared, and that is on the pre-mortem method that has gained a lot of attention and popularity. So we have links to all three of those videos on our website.
And Gary, I'll share those also in the show notes for this episode and on the website as well. It's been an absolute pleasure. It was a great way to start the year. Author of Seeing What's Next, Gary Klein, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Aidan, for inviting me. I appreciate it.